Hello, 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 hello. So, I am going to get my phone going here. I remember how to do it. And I am live. Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Oh, the noise that you hear in the background.
Oh, the noise that
Oh,
you
I
hear
need
in
to
the
turn this
background.
down, don't I? The noise is Oliver the cat. Please ignore him. Okay. Today we are going to be doing the final chapter of the Yearling. It has been a long season for this book. I started February, I think, 2019, and much has happened in my life during that time. And there was a season where I was not recording at all because of my health. So that was not a fun time. And then we moved from Tennessee back home to Texas. So, all that being said, I have been much more diligent these last few weeks to make sure that I do finish this book. It was published in 1938. So that is many, many, many years ago. And I will let you know, I will just do this here and I will show you where I am getting this from. The actual book is at this website. It is, these are public domain books. It's the Project Gutenberg. And um, this Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings is the author, and she was born in 1896 and died in 1953. Sorry, my nose itches. So, she, I don't know very much about her history. Really should look that up. Maybe that would be a good research project for someone who's reading this book for a class. Um, Oliver is going to come and join us, I think, because he hears me talking and he thinks it's time to eat, but it's not. So, today I'm going to be, the book is illustrated by uh, Newell Converse Wyatt, and his date of birth was 1882 and he died in 1945. So, and the illustrations are in the video from that says the live broadcast, the live stream. So the one with the yellow page on it. I'm going to wait just a couple more minutes and see if anyone joins me. There's Oliver. he's come to join us today. So, thank you for coming to the party. I hope you've enjoyed this book. I enjoy doing the voices. So, that's why I like this book. So, let me get down here to our chapter. Abruptly with the last chapter, and I will read you the last paragraph. Jody threw the gun aside and dropped flat on his stomach. He retched and vomited and retched again. He clawed into the earth with his fingernails. He beat it with his fists. The sinkhole rocked around him. A far roaring became a thin humming. He sank into blackness as into a dark pool. He had just had to shoot Flag because his mother had shot the deer because he had eaten up more of the crops. And so here we go. The Yearling, chapter 33, the final chapter. Jody walked north up the Fort Gates Road. His gait was wooden, as though nothing of him were alive except his legs. He had left the dead yearling without daring to look at him. Nothing mattered but getting away. There was no place to go. That did not matter either. Above Fort Gates, he would cross the river on the ferry. His plans became clear. He was headed for Jacksonville. He was going to Boston. He would find Oliver Hutto in Boston and go to sea with him, leaving his betrayal behind him, as Oliver had done. The best way to get to Jacksonville and Boston was by boat. He had better get on the river itself at once. He needed a boat. He remembered Nellie Ginwright's discarded dugout, in which he and Penny had crossed Salt Springs Run on the hunt for old Slewfoot. At thought of his father, a sharp knife stuck his cold numbness. Then the wound froze over again. He would tear his shirt in strips and stuff the cracks of the dugout and pole down the creek to Lake George, then north down the big river. Somewhere along it he would hail a passing steamer and go to Boston. Oliver would pay his fare when he got there. If he could not find him, then they would put him in jail. That did not matter either. He turned in at Salt Springs. He was thirsty and waded out in the shallow water and bent and drank from the bubbling spring. Mullet jumped nearby, and blue crabs scuttled sideways. Below the spring, a fisherman was setting out. Jody walked along the bank and called to him. "Can I go down with you a piece to my boat?" "I reckon." The fisherman swung in to shore and he stepped in. The man asked, "You live round here?" He shook his head. "Where's your boat at?" "Down past Miss Nellie Ginwright's." "You kin to her?" He shook his head. Questions from a stranger were probes in his wounds. The man looked at him curiously, then gave himself to his rowing. The rough boat moved smoothly down the swift current. The run was broad at its upper reaches. The water was blue, and the March sky over it was blue. A light wind stirred the white clouds. It was the kind of day he had always liked particularly. The banks were of a rosy red, for the swamp maple and the redbud were in full spring color. Swamp laurel was in bloom, and its sweetness filled the creek. An ache choked him, so that he wanted to put his hand to his throat and tear it out. The beauty of the late March day held only pain to hurt him. He did not want to look at the new needled cypresses. He watched the water and the garfish and the turtles and did not lift his eyes again. The fisherman said, "Here's Miss Nellie's place. You want to stop?" He shook his head. "My boat's on yonder." As they passed the bluff, he saw Miss Nellie standing in front of her house. The fisherman lifted his hand to her and she waved. Jody did not stir. He remembered the night in her house and the morning when she had cooked breakfast and had joked with Penny and sent them on their way feeling warm and strong and friendly. He pushed the memory aside. The run narrowed. The banks came close and were swamp and cattails. He said, "Yonder's my boat." "Why, boy, it's half sunk. I am to fix it. You got everyone coming to help you? You got oars?" He shook his head. "Here's a piece of a paddle. Sure don't look like much of a boat to me." "Well, so long." The man pushed out into the current and waved to the boy. He took a biscuit and a piece of meat from a box under the board seat and began cramming them in his mouth as he moved away. The odor of the food came to Jody. It reminded him that he had had nothing to eat in 2 days, except the few mouthfuls of smoked bear meat and the few kernels of dried corn. That did not matter. He was not hungry. He pulled the dugout on land and bailed it. Long immersion had swelled it, and the bottom was tight. There were cracks in the bow that let in water. He tore the sleeves from his shirt and ripped them in strips and caulked the cracks. He went to a pine and scraped resin with his pocket knife and worked it in on the outside. He pushed the dugout into the stream and picked up the broken paddle and began to paddle downstream. He was clumsy at it, and the current took him from one bank to the other. He landed in sawgrass and cut his hands trying to push through it. The dugout swung sideways and stuck in the soft muck along the south bank. He pushed free. The trick of it began to come to him, but he felt weak and faint. He wished he had asked the fisherman to wait for him. There was nothing living in sight except a buzzard wheeling in the blue sky. The buzzards would find Flag by the pool in the sinkhole. He began to be sick again and let the boat drift among the cattails. He rested his head on his knees until the nausea passed. He stiffened and began paddling. He was on his way to Boston. His mouth was tight. His eyes were narrowed. The sun was well down in the sky when he came to the end of the run. The creek emptied at once into a broad bay of Big Lake George. A spit of dry land extended a little distance to the south. On the opposite side there was only swamp. He turned the dugout and swung up to the land, stepped out, and pulled the boat high. He sat down under a live oak and leaned against the trunk and stared out to the open waters. He had hoped he might encounter a riverboat at the end of the run. He saw one just passing south, but it was far out in the lake. He realized that the end of the creek must join only an arm or a bay. It was no more than an hour or two until sunset. He was afraid to let dark find him on the open lake waters in the unsteady canoe. He decided to wait on the point of land for a passing boat. If none came, he would sleep under the light in the morning. Numbness had held off his thoughts all day. Now they poured in on him as the wolves had poured into the calf pen. They tore him so that it seemed to him that he must invisibly be bleeding as Flag had bled. Flag was dead. He would never run to him again. He tortured himself with saying the words, Flag's dead. They were as bitter as alum root tea. He had not yet probed the deepest pain. He said aloud, Pa went back on me. It was a it was a sharper horror than if Penny had died of the snake bite. He rubbed his knuckles over his forehead. Death could be borne. Father Wing had died, and he was able to bear it. Betrayal was intolerable. If Flag had died, if bear or wolf or panther had slipped in on him, he would have grieved with a great grief. But he could have endured it. He would have turned to his father, and his father would have comforted him. Without Penny, there was no comfort anywhere. The solid earth had dissolved under him. His bitterness absorbed his sorrow, and they were one. The sun dropped below the treetops. He gave up hope of hailing any vessel before night. He gathered moss and made a bed for himself at the base of the oak tree. A bittern cried rustily in the swamp across the run, and as the sun set, the frogs began to croak and sing. He had always liked the sound of their music, coming from the sinkhole at home. The cry they were making now was mournful. He hated it. They seemed to be grieving. Thousands of them were crying out in an endless and unappeasable sorrow. A wood duck called, and its cry, too, was sad. The lake was rosy, but shadows had taken over the land. It would be supper time at home. In spite of his nausea, he now thought of food. His stomach began to ache as though there was too much in it instead of nothing. He remembered the smell of the fisherman's meat and biscuit. His mouth watered. He ate some stalks of grass. He ripped the joints with his teeth as animals ripped flesh. Instantly, he saw creatures creeping into Flag's carcass. He vomited the grass. Darkness filled both land and water. A hoot owl cried in the thicket near him. He shivered. The night wind stirred and was chill. He heard a rustling that might be leaves moving ahead of the wind or small creatures passing. He was not afraid. It seemed to him that if a bear came, or a panther, he might touch it and stroke it, and it would understand his grief. Yet the night sounds about him made his flesh creep. It would be good to have a campfire. Penny could start a fire even without his tenderhorn, in the way the Indians did. But he had never been able to do it. If Penny were here, there would be a blazing fire and warmth and food and comfort. He was not afraid. He was only desolate. He pulled the moss over him and cried himself to sleep. The sun awakened him, and the red-winged blackbirds chattering in the weeds. He stood up and pulled the long strands of moss from his hair and clothing. He was weak and dizzy. Now that he was rested, he knew that he was hungry. The thought of food was torture. Cramps struck like small, hot knives across his stomach. The thought of paddling back up the run to Miss Nellie Ginwright and asking her to feed him. But she would ask him questions. She would ask him why he was here alone. And there was no answer, except that his father had betrayed him, and in the betrayal, Flag was dead. It would be better to go on as he had planned. A fresh wave of loneliness swept over him. He had lost Flag, and he had lost his father, too. The gaunt little man he had last seen crouched in pain in the kitchen doorway, calling for help to stand, was a stranger. He pushed out his dugout and took up his paddle and headed for the open waters. He was out in the world. That he was alien here and alone, and that he was being carried away into a void. He paddled for the location where he had seen the steamer pass. Living was no longer the grief behind him, but the anxiety ahead. Leaving the mouth of the creek behind him, he found the wind refreshing. Out from the shelter of the land, a brisk breeze was blowing. He ignored the gnawing in his belly and paddled desperately. The wind caught the dugout and slewed it around. He could not keep it headed. The waves were mounting. Their soft lapping changed to a hissing. They began to break over the bow of the canoe. When it swung sideways, they washed in and it tipped and rolled. There was an inch of water across the bottom. There was no vessel in sight. He looked back. The shore had receded alarmingly. Ahead of him, the open water seemed to stretch without an end. He turned about in panic and paddled madly for the shore. It would be best, after all, to go back up the creek and get help from Miss Nellie Ginwright. It might be better even to walk to Fort Gates and make his way from there. The wind behind him helped him, and it seemed to him that he could feel the northbound current of the great river. He headed for an opening that must be the end of the Salt Springs run. When he reached it, it was a blind opening in the shore that led only into swamp. The mouth of the run was nowhere to be found. He was trembling from his exertion and from his fear. He told himself that he was not lost, for the river ran north out of Lake George and came at the end to Jacksonville, and he had only to follow it. But it was so wide, and the shoreline was so confusing. He rested a long time, then began to paddle slowly north, close to the thick cypressed land, following the endless curves and bays and indentations. The gnawing in his stomach was an acute pain. He began to have a feverish vision of the usual Baxter table. He saw slices of ham steaming, brown and dripping in their own juice. He smelled the sweet savor. He saw tawny biscuits and dark crusted cornbread and swimming bowls of cowpeas with squares of white bacon floating among them. He smelled fried squirrel so definitely that the saliva ran in his mouth. He tasted the warm foam of Trixie's milk. He could have fought with the dogs for their pan of cold grits and gravy. This, then, was hunger. This was what his mother had meant when she said, "We'll all go hungry." He had laughed, for he had thought that he had known hunger, and it was faintly pleasant. He knew now that it had been only appetite. This was another thing. The thing was terrifying. It had a great maw to envelop him and claws that raked across his vitals. He fought off a new panic. He would soon reach a cabin or a fisherman's camp, he told himself. He would beg food shamelessly before continuing. No man refused another rations. He worked his way north along the shoreline all day. In the late afternoon, he was sick at his stomach from the heat of the sun. But there was nothing to vomit but the river water he had drunk. A cabin showed ahead among trees, and he pulled into it hopefully. It was deserted. He prowled inside like a hungry coon or possum. There were cans on a dusty shelf, but all were empty. In a jar, he found a cupful of musty flour. He mixed it with water and ate the paste. It was flavorless, even in his hunger, but it stopped the pain in his stomach. There were birds and squirrels in the trees, and he tried to hit them with stones, but he only drove them all away. He was feverish and exhausted, and the flour in his belly made him sleepy. The cabin offered shelter, and he made a pallet of some rags from which the roaches scurried. He slept a drugged, nightmare ridden sleep. In the morning, he was again conscious of acute hunger, and the cramps were sharp nailed fingers that twisted his entrails. He found some last year's acorns that the squirrels had buried and ate them so ravenously that the hard, unchewed pieces were fresh knives in his contracting stomach. A lethargy settled on him, and he could scarcely force himself to take up his paddle. If the current had not been with him, he decided he could have gone no farther. He covered only a short distance during the morning. In the afternoon, 3 boats passed in midstream. He stood up and waved his arms and shouted. They paid no attention to his cries. When they had passed from sight, he was torn unwillingly with sobbing. He decided to cut away from the shore to intercept the next vessel. The wind had died. The water was calm. The sun was scalding. The glare from it burned his face and neck and bare arms. His head throbbed. Black spots alternated before his eyes with bobbing golden balls. A thin humming whined in his ears. The humming snapped. All that he knew when he opened his eyes was that it was dark and he was being lifted up. A man's voice said, "He ain't drunk, it's a boy." Another said, "Lay him in the bunk there. He's sick. Tie his dugout on behind." Jody looked up. He lay in a bunk on what must be the mail boat. A lamp flickered on the wall. A man leaned over him. "What's the matter, young'un? We near about run you down in the dark." A voice called from above. "Try him on something to eat." "You hungry, boy?" He nodded. The boat was now in motion. The man in the cabin clattered at the galley stove. Jody saw a thick cup thrust in front of him. He lifted his head and clutched at it. The cup held cold soup, thick and greasy. For a mouthful or two, it had no taste at all. Then the saliva ran in his mouth, and his whole being reached out for it, and he bolted it so ravenously that he choked on bits of meat and potato. The man said curiously, "How long since you ate?" "I don't know." "Hey, Captain, the young'un don't even know when he ate last." "Give him plenty, but feed him slow. Don't give him too much, or he'll puke in my bunk." The cup came back again, and biscuits with it. He tried to control himself, but he trembled when the man waited too long between feedings. The third cupful tasted infinitely better than the first. Then further food was refused him. The man said, "Where'd you come from?" A languor crept over him. He breathed deeply. The swinging lamp drew his eyes back and forth. He closed them. He dropped into a sleep as deep as the river. Yes, Oliver, I love you. He was awakened by the stopping of the small steamer. He thought for a moment that he was in the dugout, drifting with the current. He got to his feet and rubbed his eyes. He looked at the galley stove and remembered the soup and biscuits. The ache in his stomach was gone. He climbed the few steps to the open deck. Day was breaking. The mail sack was being lowered to a landing. He recognized Volusia. The captain turned to him. "You had a close call, young feller. Now, what did you say your name was, and where do you think you're going?" I was heading for Boston, he said. You know where Boston lies? So far north it'd take you the rest of your life to get there, the way you was traveling. Jody stared. Hurry up now, this is a government boat. I can't wait on you all day. Where you live? Baxter's Island? Never heard of no Baxter's Island in this river. The mate spoke up. Tain't a real island, Cap. It's a place off in the scrub, about 15 miles up the road from here. Then you want to get off here, boy? Boston. Hell, you got folks. Jody nodded. They know where you was going? He shook his head. Running away, eh? Well, if I was a scrawny little bug-eyed booger like you, I'd stay home. Nobody but your folks'll bother with a little old shirt-tail beau like you. Swing him down to the dock, Joe. Brawny arms lifted him down. Turn his dugout loose. Catch it, boy. Let's go. The whistle blew, the side wheels churned, the mailboat chugged upstream. The wake boiled after her. A stranger lifted the mail sack and slung it over his shoulder. Jody crouched on his heels, holding the bow of the dugout. The stranger glanced at him and walked away toward Volusia with the mail. The first rays of the sun lay on the river. Alligator lilies on the far bank caught them like white cups. The current tugged at the dugout. His arm was tired, holding it. The stranger's footsteps faded up the road. There was no place left to go but Baxter's Island. He dropped into the canoe and took up his paddle. He paddled across to the west shore. He tethered the dugout to a stake. He looked back across the river. The rising sun lay on the charred ruins of the Hutto house. His throat tightened. The world had discarded him. He turned and walked slowly up the road. He was weak and conscious again of hunger, but the night's food had renewed him. The nausea was gone and the pain. He walked west without plan. There was no other direction in which to go. Baxter's Island drew him like a magnet. There was no reality but the clearing. He trudged on. He wondered if he dared go home. Probably they would not want him. He had caused them a great deal of trouble. Perhaps if he walked into the kitchen, his mother would drive him out as she had driven Flag. He was no good to anybody. He had prowled and played and eaten recklessly. They had put up with his impudence and his appetite, and Flag had destroyed the better part of the year's living. Almost certainly they would feel they were better off without him, and he would not be welcome. He loitered along the road. The sun was strong. The winter was over. He thought hazily that it must now be April. Spring had taken over the scrub, and the birds were mating and singing in the bushes. Only he, in all the world, was homeless. He had been out in the world, and the world was a troubled dream, fluid and desolate, flanked by swamps and cypresses. He stopped to rest in mid-morning at the intersection of the main road and the north road. The low vegetation here was open to the heat of the sun. His head began to ache, and he got to his feet and headed north toward Silver Glen. He told himself that he did not mean to go home. He would only go to the spring and go down between the cool, dark banks and lie a little while in the running water. The road north dipped and rose and dipped again. The sand was scalding under his bare feet. The sweat ran down the grime of his face. At the top of a rise, he could look down and see Lake George far below him to the east. It was pitilessly blue. Thin white lines were the implacable, choppy waves that had turned him back to the unfriendly shore. He trudged on. To the east, the vegetation became luxuriant. There was water near. He turned down the trail to Silver Glen. The steep bank dropped to the ribbon of creek that ran south of the great spring itself and had a kindred source. He ached in all his bones. He was so thirsty that his tongue seemed glued to the roof of his mouth. He stumbled down the bank and fell flat beside the cool, shallow water and drank. The water bubbled over his lips and nose. He drank until his belly was swollen. He felt sickened and rolled over on his back and closed his eyes. The nausea passed and he was drowsy. He lay in a stupor of weakness. He hung suspended in a timeless space. He could go neither forward nor back. Something was ended. Nothing was begun. In the late afternoon he roused. He sat up. An early magnolia blossom was wax white over him. He thought, "'Tis April." A memory stirred him. He had come here a year ago on a bland and tender day. He had splashed in the creek water and lain as now among the ferns and grasses. Something had been fine and lovely. He had built himself a flutter mill. He rose and moved with a quickening of his pulse to the location. It seemed to him that if he found it, he would discover with it all the other things that had vanished. The flutter mill was gone. The flood had washed it away, and all its merry turning. He thought stubbornly, "I'll build me another." He cut twigs for the supports and the roller to turn across them from the wild cherry tree. He whittled feverishly. He cut strips from a palmetto frond and made his paddles. He sunk the uprights in the stream bed and set the paddles turning. Up, over, down. Up, over, down. The flutter mill was turning. The silver water dripped. But it was only palmetto strips brushing the water. There was no magic in the motion. The flutter mill had lost its comfort. He said, "Play dolly." He kicked it apart with one foot. The broken bits floated down the creek. He threw himself on the ground and sobbed bitterly. There was no comfort anywhere. There was Penny. A wave of homesickness washed over him so that it was suddenly intolerable not to see him. The sound of his father's voice was a necessity. He longed for the sight of his stooped shoulders as he had never, in the sharpest of his hunger, longed for food. He clambered to his feet and up the bank and began to run down the road to the clearing, crying as he ran. His father might not be there. He might be dead. With the crops ruined and his son gone, he might have packed up in despair and moved away, and he would never find him. He sobbed, "Pa, wait for me." The sun was setting. He was in a panic that he would not reach the clearing before dark. He exhausted himself and was obliged to slow down to a walk. His flesh quivered, his heart pounded. He had to stop entirely and rest. Darkness overtook him a half a mile from home. Even in the dusk, landmarks were familiar. The tall pines of the clearing were recognizable, blacker than the creeping night. He came to the slat fence. He felt his way along it. He opened the gate and went into the yard. He passed around the side of the house to the kitchen stoop and stepped up on it. He crept to the window on bare, silent feet and peered in. A fire burned low on the hearth. Penny sat hunched beside it, wrapped in quilts. One hand covered his eyes. Jody went to the door and unlatched it and stepped inside. Penny lifted his head. "Oi, it's me." He thought his father had not heard him. "It's Jody." Penny turned his head and looked at him wonderingly, as though the gaunt, ragged boy with sweat and tear streaks down the grime, with hollow eyes under matted hair, were some stranger of whom he expected that he stayed his business. He said, "Jody?" Jody dropped his eyes. "Come close." He went to his father and stood beside him. Penny reached out for his hand and took it and turned it over and rubbed it slowly between his own. Jody felt drops on his hand like warm rain. "Boy, I near about give you out." Penny felt along his arm. He looked up at him. "You all right?" He nodded. "You all right. You ain't dead nor gone. You all right." A light filled his face. "Glory be." It was unbelievable, Jody thought. He was wanted. He said, "I had to come home." "Why, sure you did. I ain't meant what I said, hating you." The light broke into this familiar smile. "Why, sure you ain't. When I was a child, I spake as a child." Penny stirred in his chair. "They's rations in the safe, in the kittle there. You hungry?" "I ain't ate but once last night." "Not but once? Then how you know old starvation?" His eyes shone in the firelight as Jody had pictured to them. "Oh, starvation. He's got a face meaner'n old Slewfoot, ain't he?" "It's fearful. There's biscuits there. Open the honey. There's due to be milk in the gourd." Jody fumbled among the dishes. He ate standing, wolfing down the food. He dipped into a dish of cooked cowpeas with his fingers, scooping them into his mouth. Penny stared at him. He said, "I'm sorry you had to learn it that way." "Where's Ma?" "She's drove the wagon to the Forsters to trade for seed corn. She figured she'd try to plant a pot of crop again. She carried the chickens to trade. It hurted her pride terrible, but she was obliged to go." Jody closed the door of the cabinet. He said, "I should have washed. I'm awful dirty." "There's warm water on the hearth." Jody poured the water in the basin and scrubbed his face and arms and hands. The water was too dark even for his feet. He threw it out of the door and poured more and sat on the floor and washed his feet. Penny said, "I'd be proud to know where you been." "I been on the river. I aim to go to Boston." "I see." He looked small and shrunken inside the quilts. Jody said, "How you making it, Pa? You better?" Penny looked a long time into the embers on the hearth. He said, "You just as good know the truth. I ain't scarcely worth shooting." Jody said, "When I get the work done, you got to leave me go fetch old Doc to you." Penny studied him. He said, "You've done come back different. You've taken the punishment. You ain't a yearling no longer." Jody, "Yes, sir." "I'm going to talk to you man to man. You figured I went back on you. Now there's a thing every man has got to know. Maybe you know it already. 'Twa'n't only me. 'Twa'n't only your yearling deer having to be destroyed. Boy, life goes back on you." Jody looked at his father. He nodded. Penny said, "I've seen how things goes in the world of man. You've knowed men to be low down and mean. You've seed old Death at his tricks. You've messed around with old Starvation. Every man wants life to be a fine thing and easy. 'Tis fine, boy, powerful fine, but 'tain't easy. Life knocks a man down, and he gets up and it knocks him down again. I've been uneasy all my life." His hands worked at the folds of the quilt. "I wanted life to be easy for you. Easier 'twas for me. A man's heart aches seeing his young'uns face the world, knowing they got to get their guts tore out the way his was tore. I wanted to spare you as long as I could. I wanted you to frolic with your yearling. I know the lonesomeness he eased for you, but every man's lonesome. What's he to do then? What's he to do when he gets knocked down? Why, take it for his share and go on, Jody said. I'm ashamed I runned off. Penny sat upright. He said, you're near enough growed to do your choosing. Could be you'd crave to go to sea, like Oliver. There's men seems made for the land, and men seems made for the sea. But I'd be proud did you choose to live here and farm the clearing. I'd be proud to see the day when you got a well dug, so's no woman here'd be obliged to do her washing on a seepage hillside. You willing? I'm willing. Shake hands. He closed his eyes. The fire on the hearth had burned to embers. Jody banked them with the ashes to assure live coals in the morning. Penny said, now I need some help getting to the bed. Looks like your ma's spending the night. Jody put his shoulder under him, and Penny leaned heavily on it. He hobbled to his bed. Jody drew the quilt over him. It's food and drink to have you home, boy. Get to bed and get your rest. Night. The words warmed him through. Night, Pa. He went to his room and closed the door. He took off his tattered shirt and breeches and climbed in under the warm quilt. His bed was soft and yielding. He lay luxuriously, stretching his legs. He must be up early in the morning to milk the cow and bring in wood and work the crops. When he worked them, Flag would not be there to play about with him. His father would no longer take the heavy part of the burden. It did not matter. He could manage alone. He found himself listening for something. It was the sound of the yearling for which he listened, running around the house or stirring on his moss pallet in the corner of the bedroom. He would never hear him again. He wondered if his mother had thrown dirt over Flag's carcass, or if the buzzards had cleaned it. Flag. He did not believe he should ever again love anything, man or woman, or his own child, as he had loved the yearling. He would be lonely all his life, but a man took it for his share and went on. In the beginning of his sleep, he cried out, Flag! It was not his own voice that called. It was a boy's voice. Somewhere beyond the sinkhole, past the magnolia, under the live oaks, a boy and a yearling ran side by side and were gone forever. And that is the end of the yearling. Ah! And I have a lot of people on. Hello, everyone. Attitude Cool and my friend Rhythmic Excursions. Hello, my friend. We're in Texas now, in case you didn't know. Vihan and Anna. Hello, everyone. We finished the book. We finished the book. Whoop, whoop. Party. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it just amazing? Oh my goodness. I have a lot of stuff here on my phone. So, how is everybody? Did you like the book? Now, don't forget, the next book is Holes. Okay? So tell me. Is everybody doing good today? Oh, Oliver's saying hello. Oliver, say hello. That was his hello. Did you hear it? Eh. Are you all still here or did you leave me? It was a long chapter. It made me almost cry. He loved that deer. So, I'm going to wait to see if anybody responds. And if not, I am going to sign off on the Yearling. It has taken me a long time to get through this book, but I read it when I was in about the 6th or 7th grade. And I loved it then, and it was just as good this time, if not better, because I understood it more, I think. Is anybody still there? Well, Oliver says hello. The Oliver kitty cat. What's you doing, Oliver? Yeah, are you talking? Are you saying hello to everyone? Oh, that was a hello, everybody. All right, so this stream is going on almost an hour. It has been a joy, and don't forget, starting next week, Holes by Lewis Sacker. Now, any of you teachers, if you would like the worksheets and the study guide that goes along with Holes, please email me and I'll put it in the chat. MIZTU. Oop, I forgot the T. TOR at gmail.com. And I will send you to the website where you can download the worksheets for free. Yes. I am a member of Super Teacher Worksheets. And if you don't know about Super Teacher Worksheets, I am going to give you that is website for the study guide. So, my friends, we are coming to the end of our stream. And I'm going to sing you the blessing today. So until next time, may the Lord bless and keep you. May he make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace, and give you peace. Shalom, everyone. Until the next book.